Please join me and welcome radical feminist pioneer, Miss Gloria Steinem.
I am so glad to be in this room, right? The world is going crazy out there. We so need our chosen family here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I began to hear how lucky I was to be invited to this place. People told me how tough it was in Memphis, how difficult in the parts of the 3 states that you serve. A friend called me up and told me that's Ed Kaplan's story about the press conference bluff that were, the reputation of this Planned Parenthood goes before it reaches New York, reaches absolutely everywhere. I also want to thank the Republicans in this room. You are the real Republicans. You stand up for reproductive freedom. The Republican Party was the first to support the Equal Rights Amendment. And here's my hopeaholic idea. Now that Trump has ignored the current party, maybe real centrist Republicans can take it back from the extremists. But most of all, I want to remind us tonight that nothing but nothing is more important than ensuring our fundamental right to reproductive freedom. Power over our own bodies, the principle that government power stops at our skins. Because all the artificial hierarchies in the world begin with controlling reproduction and therefore controlling the bodies of females. If we didn't have wombs, we'd be fine. But it is absolutely basic that we achieve reproductive freedom. I think it helps, perhaps, to understand that it wasn't always true that we didn't have it. In fact, it seems like for 95% of human history, there was reproductive freedom. I have gone out with the Kwe and the San women, the so-called bush people of southern Africa, who are the original relatives of absolutely every one of us here. And the women would show me the herbs that they pick for contraception, for abortifacients, for headaches, for migraine headaches. Incredibly sophisticated knowledge of how to influence our own bodies. They have languages that have no gendered pronouns. There's no he and she. People are people. What a concept. They have games that they showed me, which involve, it's kind of like a relay race. You're singing a song and throwing gourds to each other in lines, and the goal of the game is to throw the gourd so that someone else can catch it. Now, not so they can't. The goal of the game is cooperation, not competition. How amazing is that? So it turns out, actually, that the desire to control reproduction and therefore to control women's bodies literally is the first step in absolutely every hierarchy. And with race, class, or caste, as in India, the need to control reproduction and keep women subordinate increases. It is true in this country that race and sex are intertwined. It is not possible to be a feminist without also being an anti-racist. And it is not possible to defeat racism without including everyone, which includes women of that race, equally to men of that race. And to fight racism by fighting the impulse to continue division, which again, full circle, requires controlling reproduction. They are completely intertwined. They cannot be fought together separately. And even before we had intersectionality, we had double jeopardy. Do you remember that? We have different words for it, but we have always deeply, deeply understood the connection. And we understand that racism is bad for all women in different ways. It's possible and probable that the so-called superior group, as we should understand in this country, given our history in the South, that the so-called superior group, that is white women, are sexually and physically restricted in order to maintain the quote-unquote purity of the white race. And black women, the supposedly inferior group, women of color, their bodies are exploited in order to produce cheap labor. One may be restricted, the other exploited, but both are oppressed by the maintenance of racism. Once long ago, I went to interview Fannie Lou Hamer, the great Fannie Lou Hamer, for the ACLU, which had cases about forced illegal sterilization and needed Fannie Lou's testimony because she had bravely come forward and said that when she entered a Mississippi hospital, she was sterilized for another procedure, something completely different. She was sterilized without her knowledge or her permission. And Fannie Lou was very, very clear that the generations of women before her had had as many as 20 children, mostly by rape, in order to produce cheap labor. She herself was sterilized. And what was the difference between those two eras? Farm machinery. So less labor was needed. What could be more clear about the brutality of controlling women's bodies as the means of reproduction? And she knew that at the same time, white women, white Southern women and Northern women who wanted to be sterilized, who sought out of their free will and even desperation to be sterilized, could not get such an operation unless they had 2 children and their husband's permission. What could be more clear about racism than that? It is the rock bottom truth of controlling women's bodies. And also, it's clear, and sometimes people on campus who talk to me are quite mystified by this, why is it that the same people who are, and groups are against birth control and abortion are also against sex between 2 women or 2 men? They find that quite mysterious. But actually, it is not mysterious, because the whole point is that the same groups are against all sex that cannot end in reproduction. That is clear in religion. It's clear in politics. The very same groups are against any sex that can't end in reproduction, and the very same groups are in crisis right now because this country is about to become, in about 20 minutes, a country that is no longer majority European American or white. That seems to be kind of great, you know, because we'll finally be more connected to other countries, we'll be less isolated. But to people who have grown up in an artificial hierarchy and whose identity has become dependent on that hierarchy, it's very scary. And we find ourselves now at this juncture when those who have placed their identity with the white race or with the male gender or both, are in a form of panic and rebellion. It is a very, very dangerous time. The same groups are against immigration because, as they will look me in the eye and tell me, the white race is committing suicide, as if there were such a thing as race. Excuse me, we made up gender, we made up race, and we can unmake them up. But they go very deep, and I think in some ways this country is now in the same place as a woman who is trying to escape a violent household. We understand that the point of escape is the point of maximum danger for her. She is most likely to be beaten or killed just before or after she escapes because she is escaping control. She is going for freedom, right? I think this country is going for freedom. But this is a point of maximum danger. And we have to look after each other and be aware and take care. And yet at the same time, just as we would never tell any woman to stay in a violent household, or any man to stay in a violent household, we have to understand that we must keep going because we are about to be free. Also, I think we need to connect the issue of global warming with reproduction, because the old movements which were about population control, a phrase that told you that the decision was being made somewhere other than by the woman, controlled by somebody else, were racist often in the way that they applied population control. And so the discussion was rightly halted. But the discussion must resume as one of reproductive freedom, because it is the lack of reproductive freedom, the forcing of women to have children they don't want and can't take care of. The second biggest cause of death for teenage girls in this world, globally, teenage girls, is early marriage, childhood marriage, and forced childbirth. That forced childbirth is the single biggest cause of global warming. And we must make that connection, which is not being made. I'm really glad that the Pope is against global warming, but I wish he would notice that he is causing its root, its biggest reason for being, by forcing women to have children they don't want. I saw a button actually in Europe that said, The Pope is a disgrace to the skirt he has on. Okay, it's a nicer Pope than the ones before, but he has to address himself to women, which he has absolutely, absolutely not done. And also, in terms of making connections, which I think is where we are, really, you know, in some ways, movements grow up in silos because they have to, because there's a group of people who have been invisible, and so they need to rise up and name ourselves and say what our issues are and say, here we are. But we are now in a time when we need to make connections between those silos and understand that we are truly all in a circle. We are all connected, and these issues are connected. Equal pay, for instance. Equal pay, we all talk about it, but we don't say that it is also the single biggest economic stimulus this country could ever have. When we talk about economic stimulus, we talk about bankers and Wall Street. No, equal pay for women of all races would put, I have forgotten how much, like $2 billion in the economy every year. And it would diminish tax dollars spent on the poorest households who are female-headed households. I mean, it is definitely a win-win, and yet we never make that connection, just as we never make the connection, or rarely make the connection between reproduction and global warming. So I submit to you that, somebody said God is in the details, I think, right? The goddess is in connections. So we have to continue to make these connections. And one of the biggest ones is understanding that violence against females, which comes from trying to control reproduction, is actually the single biggest cause of violence internal to a nation or violence, military violence committed by a nation, because it normalizes violence in our daily family lives and makes us feel that it is human nature and that it is inevitable. There is a very helpful book called Sex and World Peace, produced by scholars in Texas, subversively at the Bush School. Right. That proves in every current country that the single biggest cause of violence internal to the country or its willingness to be militarily violent is not poverty, not access to natural resources, not religion or degree of democracy, it's violence against females. And that is, again, rooted in reproduction. So I am here to say to you that there is no cause on earth that is more important than what you are doing. And I know that it feels so frustrating and painful that you are fighting the same battle over and over and over again, but that is because it is the battle. It is the single most important thing that you can possibly do. So, because there are so many individual women who are grateful to you for their lives, because whether or not a woman can decide when and whether to have children is the single biggest element in whether we are educated or not, whether we can work outside the home or not, and how long we live. It is so, so deeply important, and I don't think that you get thanked enough, right? So I just wanted to read you my thanks, which really is to you, okay? It's the dedication of my book about being on the road, but it applies to this room, and it comes from the hearts of every woman who has been served by Planned Parenthood. This book is dedicated to Dr. John Sharp of London, who in 1957, a decade before physicians in England could legally perform an abortion for any reason other than the health of the woman, took the considerable risk of referring for an abortion a 22-year-old American on her way to India. Knowing only that she had broken an engagement at home to seek an unknown fate, he said, "You must promise me two things. First, you will not tell anyone my name. Second, you will do what you want to do with your life." Dear Dr. Sharp, I believe you, who knew the law was unjust, would not mind if I say this so long after your death. I've done the best I could with my life. This book is for you. That is the individual, personal gratitude that every woman and every man served by Planned Parenthood feels. Whether they can express it to you or not, it is in their hearts. And the fact of your work to establish reproductive freedom, to eliminate that first step in every hierarchy, means that you are doing the most important thing in bringing about the kinds of societies that we had for most of human history, in which the paradigm was a circle, not a pyramid. We were linked, we were not ranked. And it is fundamental to our future linking, our respect for our unique individuality and our shared humanity, that your work continue, that your work succeed. I thank you so much for being in this room and making the biggest difference the world could possibly need. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.